interesting a Wednesday as we have had all year. Join me after the news.
On your radio, on the LBC app, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 6 o'clock, there are concerns about heightened community tensions in the UK following exchanges of fire in Kashmir. Pakistan has vowed to respond to Indian missile strikes, which have killed 26 people. It follows a terror attack on the Indian side of Kashmir last month. Social integration expert Dr. Rakib Ehsan has told LBC events around the world affect relations here.
We had the August-September 2022 Leicester disorders. And I felt that was a major wake-up call, a watershed moment in British community relations. And the reality is that British community relations are increasingly influenced, indeed determined, by foreign events, whether they are in the Middle East, the Horn of Africa, or in this case, the Indian subcontinent.
133 cardinals have begun their secret conclave meeting at the Sistine Chapel. All of them took an oath of secrecy before casting their vote in the first ballot to choose the next pope. The Transport Secretary says it's a no-brainer to let 18-year-olds drive trains. The government is lowering the minimum age from 20 because of concerns about driver shortages. And environment experts have declared a medium risk of drought in England this summer after the driest start to spring in almost 70 years. They've urged water companies to do more to cut leakages and help customers save water. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 38 points at 85.59. The pound buys $1.33 and €1.17. LBC weather, cloud cover for much of the UK tonight. A shower possible in eastern areas, but generally clearer in the west. A low of 4 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Amelia Cox.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. It's 6 p.m. Now, Tonight with Andrew Marr.
Good evening. The people have spoken. But as of this evening, the government hasn't really heard them. I'm talking mainly about the much-hated removal of the winter fuel allowance from pensioners, blamed for a torrent of votes gurgling away from Labour to Reform in last week's elections. Alongside this, there's growing unease about the impact of higher energy bills generally, including on British industry. On yesterday's show, you might have noticed two influential Labour figures suggesting that the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, is going to have to swallow her pride and shift direction. And at Prime Minister's questions earlier today, Keir Starmer was battered by all the opposition parties, a pretty rare pincer movement attack.
Pensioners are poorer and colder because of his decisions. All the while, energy has got more expensive for everyone.
Among the messages voters sent ministers last week, one stood out. Bring back the winter fuel payment for millions of struggling pensioners.
So can I ask the Prime Minister, in fact, can I invite the Prime Minister to come to Aberdeen and explain to my constituents why he is willing to move heaven and earth to save jobs in Scunthorpe while destroying jobs in Scotland?
He strongly defended his policies on net zero and the need for more investment, including in nuclear power. But he didn't say a word about the winter fuel allowance issue. His spokesman insists he will not change direction. With the Red Wall group of Labour MPs and Baroness Morgan, Labour's First Minister in Wales, also begging him to do so, the official line is, and I quote, "The public didn't elect this Labour government to be knocked off course." Well, I'm not so sure about that. If the public thinks that a particular course is the wrong course, then they would love the government to be knocked off it. Tonight, I think what we really need to talk about is the politics of Treasury U-turns. And meanwhile, if this has been a strong day for the Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch, in the Chamber, then it's not been a great day for her in the opinion polls. The latest has Reform at its highest ever at 29 points, Labour down to 22, and the Tories just 1 point ahead of the Lib Dems at 17. That's the Conservatives' worst showing since the Brexit mayhem. I suppose, therefore, the ideal guest tonight would be somebody who can explain the pros and cons of chancellors ditching unpopular policies and can also give some candid and friendly advice to the Tory leader. Luckily, I have that guest. A little earlier today, the former Chancellor, George Osborne, was in the back of my cab. We discussed the winter fuel allowance cut. I wanted to get his candid advice on what the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, should do now.
The kind of thing about the winter fuel payment cut that she's made is it doesn't actually save very much money. And it was basically the first thing the government did, and therefore a lot of people noticed, and it came without any explanation. And so if I were her, I would sort of, rather than just dig in, I would kind of find a new, introduce a new kind of payment for winter time, and then so you sort of change the terms of the debate.
A new threshold, or tax it, or something.
Just sometimes you just need to sort of muddy the water and create some new form of allowance, and so you're no longer, you're not comparing apples with apples. I think it's important. It's also a hard calculation for any Prime Minister to make, which is when do you kind of dig in, show you're not for turning, be the Mrs. T, or when do you realise that it's, you're digging yourself further into that hole I was talking about. And I think on this, it's not really serving any wider purpose. It's not part of some...
So your candid advice would be chuck it.
Well, I defer a bit to my podcast partner, Ed Balls. You very kindly came on Political Currency the other day. And Ed, who's obviously steeped in Labour and steeped in the sort of Labour Treasury thinking, he right from the word go said this is a really big mistake, and he has been saying get rid of it. Personally, I wouldn't just get rid of it. I might find a reform that makes the problem go away.
Whether it's reform or abolition, do you think it's inevitable now, given the unpopularity of this measure, that it's going to go?
No, I don't think it's inevitable, precisely because I don't think there's any risk of losing it in Parliament. This is a decision for Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. I mean, I am told that when this was first discussed in number 10 Downing Street, in other words, when the Chancellor came to the Prime Minister and said, this is what I'm planning to do, this wasn't even in the first budget. This was a kind of early statement from the government. The Prime Minister didn't raise any questions about it. So I think he's probably thinking, a bit culpable that he didn't challenge the Chancellor, because there is a job of the Prime Minister to, I always felt as Chancellor, to make sure that the Chancellor is doing things that are politically sellable for the whole government. And I think they'll be tempted to just say, look, it'll blow over. There are lots of other reasons, Labour are struggling. Winter's a long time away. But I don't know. I wouldn't want to kind of get to next winter and still be having a row.
What about amour propre? The extent to which it's just embarrassing. It's even a little bit humiliating for a Chancellor to change their mind in public.
Well, politics is full of embarrassment and humiliation. You just have to be careful about, not having too much of it. I think from a Chancellor's point of view, obviously, the job comes with a requirement to be solid and immovable. But at the same time, it's a very, I mean this not in a kind of bad way, it's a very political role. The thing you're dealing with is money and how much taxes you raise and how much you spend. And you've got to be a political Chancellor as well as, a Chancellor with a big vision of the future of the country. And you've got to help carry your government. And I don't know, it feels to me that I guess I was somewhat surprised that we've got through winter. This payment was paid only to half of pensioners some months ago, and yet it featured a lot. It clearly did feature a lot in the local elections. Now, whether that's a kind of symbol of things that have gone wrong for the Labour government, or, that people don't really understand.
It's certainly stuck in people's mind,
So whether it's a specific measure, I think it's stuck in people's mind, Andrew, because it was the first thing you heard from this new government. They got elected with a massive majority. And then what was really the first big announcement? After a few weeks, they cut the winter fuel payment. They actually scrapped some road schemes at the same time. And then you had the row about, Taylor Swift tickets and kind of problems in number 10 with the Chief of Staff. And that was the initial impression of that Labour of last year. And that's a big problem. I think they've been struggling ever since. And you compare it to the Blair-Brown first, 100 days, if you want to use a kind of Americanism, with the independence of the Bank of England. Compare it to the Cameron-Clegg coalition government and the Rose Garden. People lampoon it a bit now, but it had a kind of confidence and a sense of a plan to it. And I think they're still paying a price for a poor start. Personally, I'm not as partisan as I obviously used to be. I think Keir Starmer's doing quite a good job on the international stage, and I think he's doing actually quite a good job at handling Trump, which is one of the kind of big tests of being a leader of a country at the moment. So there are lots of things that are actually going quite well, and I think the Indian trade deal
I was going to ask you about that.
Is a good achievement.
Because Nigel Farage says it's scandalous beyond belief and undercuts British workers.
But, I don't want to relitigate Brexit, but the Brexiteers pulled us out of our big trade deal, which was the single market and the customs union with the European Union. And then they promised us all sorts of other trade deals, most of which have not materialised, whereas the American one, I remember Barack Obama warning we'd be at the back of the line, and sure enough, back of the queue, sure enough, we appear to have been. And then when it comes to this Indian trade deal, there were a succession of Tory prime ministers who tried to land this and didn't. And in the end, to secure a trade deal, if you're negotiating by yourself, if you're not part of a big bloc, you have to make some compromises. And it feels to me quite a small compromise that for a couple of years, Indian workers here who are paying an equivalent to national insurance to the Indian government don't pay national insurance here. I mean, I think, what probably the government should have done is explain better that this thing was coming, because it sort of landed out of the blue, this Indian trade deal. And so the ground wasn't particularly well laid. I don't think it's been explained that it's a kind of form of double taxation agreement, which is a kind of complicated way of saying kind of things we agree with other countries. And of course, I don't think it's been helped at all by the hostilities between India and Pakistan coming just hours later. So that's kind of confused everything. But fundamentally, it's a good thing for the UK. And I think in a world where, our kind of traditional ally, the United States, is making life pretty difficult for us with tariffs, I think to show that other countries like India are prepared to strike deals with us is a good thing.
A good mitigation for Trump.
Yeah, it doesn't, unfortunately, completely compensate, but it's hard. I tried to do various things with the Indian government and the Indian parliament, and being a massive, messy democracy, it's quite hard to land things with the Indian state. And so I think they've done a pretty good job from what I can see.
How worried are you at the moment about the effect of Trump on the economy?
Well, I'd say I'm more worried about the effect of Trump on our security. And of course, security underpins our economy. The economic impact has been bad because it's created uncertainty. I think if you're a company, or where are you going to invest? Are you going to build a new factory? You don't know how much you're going to be able to sell these things for to big markets like the US. And even if he kind of rose back on some of the tariffs, as the government here are trying to get him to do, I think quite a lot of the damage has been done just by the uncertainty. And the tariffs are like a form of tax. They make things more expensive. But what worries me is more, the fact that people begin to doubt whether the Americans would be there, if Europe was attacked, if NATO really was attacked. The NATO promise, has always, I guess, ultimately depended on a decision of the American president. Whatever treaty you sign and whatever annual meeting you have, ultimately the American president's always going to be the person who decides whether to send American troops to the rescue. But I guess Trump has kind of called that out and put that in doubt. And that, for my mind, makes life much more dangerous. Certainly, it takes us back to a world I grew up in, but kind of ended when I was at university, which was, a world where we were, of course, very nervous about what was happening in what was then the Soviet Union or behind the Iron Curtain, now in Russia. And certainly, we're about to celebrate VE Day. Our involvement in the Second World War started with the invasion of Poland. So the idea that these things
are far away, they're not.
We are constantly reminded they're not.
We were talking a moment ago about Nigel Farage. There's a poll from YouGov this morning which puts Reform on 29 points, which is their highest number yet. And the Conservatives, I have to say, at 17 points, just 1 point ahead of the Lib Dems. That's quite close to levels at which, if it was in an election, you'd be almost extinct as a party.
Well, I feel I'm kind of earning veteran status, having been around politics for a long time. Coming here into Millbank, I think I first came in here 30 years ago. And I've heard several times that there'll never be another Conservative government, and I heard several times there'll never be another Labour government. Both things true not to be the case. So I'm not someone who believes all the kind of hype that we've seen the end of the two-party system. And I think it is exceptionally difficult for a Conservative opposition just recently ejected from government to come back. I think the only example I can think of the one-term government in my lifetime was the Ted Heath government at the very beginning of my life. So it is, the task facing Kemi Badenoch and the shadow cabinet is historically huge, even though this Labour government haven't made such a strong start. And so I have some sympathy with the position they're in. I don't personally think chasing Nigel Farage's tail is going to work. And if you want Nigel Farage, why not have Nigel Farage? I think the kind of 10-year trend inside the Conservative movement of trying to copy the Brexit Party or the UKIP Party or now the Reform Party has not really worked.
It certainly hasn't. One of your successors, Jeremy Hunt, Conservative Chancellor, said that he thinks the extinction of the Conservatives can't be ruled out.
Yeah, I mean, look, I find it hard to believe that we've just had 14 years of a Conservative governments. The Conservative Party has governed our country for about 3/4 of the last 200 years. I mean, I think it's unlikely it's about to disappear. I think the big kind of question is, does it strike some kind of deal with reform? And the deal with reform, let's be honest, is not going to be the personnel in reform other than Farage, because they don't, it's a bit of a one-man band. I know, of course, lots of reform councillors have been elected, and, my friend Andrew Jenkins has just become the mayor of Greater Lincolnshire. But fundamentally, the appeal there is built around Nigel Farage. And so that, it's more of a question of whether the Conservative movement finds a way to adopt him. And, of course, the price he'll extract is to be the Prime Minister or the Prime Ministerial candidate. And that will be a big temptation to a lot of Conservatives. Personally, I would... there's a big space at the moment in British politics for someone who's got a plan to grow the British economy, which strikes me as the main concern for most of the public. So if we spoke a little bit less about transgender toilets and a bit more about taxes, then we might be on to something. We might be on to, no Conservative opposition in my lifetime has got back without winning back credibility on the economy and making that the central offer at the election.
Is that the fundamental mistake that the Conservative leadership is making at the moment? In other words, following the culture war and not being a mainstream, education, health, taxation, economy opposition?
Well, I think it's certainly the case that Kemi Badenoch, made a reputation for herself and speaks very effectively and with passion on kind of cultural issues, cultural war issues, transgender rights and the like. But it's not. That's what helps you be the rising star. I don't think it sustains you as a risen star. I think to be the leader of the opposition, you have to be someone who offers the country a credible economic plan. And there is a bit of a gap in the market. No one at the moment has got a plan that certainly has convinced the public is going to grow the British economy. And, I mean, you could argue for the Conservative Party. I mean, we are celebrating, if that's the right way to put it, the 10th anniversary of the 2015 election today, and the 10th anniversary of the end of the coalition government, which I was part of. And, of course, then there was a majority Conservative government under David Cameron for a short period until the referendum. But, it's not been since the coalition government that the country has had that long-term economic plan that it has confidence in, that commanded public support.
That's what you need.
And I don't think the opposition is offering it, but the good news for the opposition is there's a gap in the market for it.
This is a safe space of truth and candour and straight talking. Do you think
truth and reconciliation, I think, is what Prince Harry calls it?
Not necessarily reconciliation. Do you think Kemi Badenoch will be leader of the Conservative Party at the next election?
I think she's got a better chance than anyone else, not least because she's in the post. And I don't think anyone really thinks that switching leader is the solution to the problem.
Second candid question. Could you vote for a Conservative alliance or group where Nigel Farage was the Prime Ministerial candidate? You personally.
That is a good question. I would have quite a lot of reservations because I think...
So you're verging on no?
I'm verging on no, but I certainly would not vote for reform. And, I mean, my politics is, on the centre-right, but the centre bit is as important as the right.
George Osborne, thank you very much indeed for that.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. Coming up, India have launched strikes on Pakistan after a terrorist incident in Kashmir. Now, this is dangerous, but what could it mean for the streets of Britain? We're going to talk about that next, but the time now, 6:19.
LBC.
Details.
Tonight with Andrew Marr. Watch live on both Global Player and the new LBC app.
6:21. The world is suffering from enough wars, isn't it? And yet the latest trouble between India and Pakistan, two nuclear-armed countries, threatens a horrible new one. Their argument is over Kashmir, a Muslim-majority territory inside India, and there is a long, sad history of terrorist attacks and then military reprisals and now even threats to cut off the water supplies on which tens of millions of people depend. So far, at least 26 people, including children, have died and 46 have been injured after India launched missile attacks on what it said were terrorist sites in Pakistan. Pakistan's called this an act of war and says it's shot down several Indian fighter jets, and now the country's Prime Minister says its armed forces have been authorised to undertake corresponding actions. This is all very worrying, but it's also quite close to home, given that Britain is home to large Pakistani and Indian communities. There's already been an angry standoff outside the Indian High Commission in London. Could Kashmir, therefore, be the next example, after Gaza, of overseas conflicts spilling onto the streets of Britain? Let's hear now from John Woodcock, Lord Walney, the government's former independent advisor on political violence and disruption. John, I think, looking at the last census, there's about 2 million plus Pakistanis living in this country and 2 million plus people of Indian descent as well. How politically engaged are they about events back home?
Well, you will, as you would expect, I think, have a diversity of views within that, and this will, whatever happens, this is going to deeply impact on the sense of threat and security that many British heritage Pakistanis and heritage Indians have in the country. It's interesting that you compare this to Gaza and say, is this going to be the next example? And we may well see a level of tension. There has been some, as you say, within the last 24 hours. There is some recent history of standoffs within certain communities.
Particularly in the Midlands.
Particularly in the Midlands. In Leicester, my friend Lord Austin has been looking at a review into the violence and extremism in Leicester from 2023. But you see, I'd be really surprised if there is anything like the level of unrest that has been triggered by the conflict in Gaza, and you could make an argument that that's about the ongoing severity of it, but actually I think probably it is about a disproportionate reaction to anything that involves Israel in the Middle East.
It's the particularly Israeli aspect of that. I'm just interested to the extent to which I mean, an awful lot of people have been radicalised over Gaza.
Yeah.
And the question is whether, when it comes to Kashmir, a much smaller proportion of people of Indian and Pakistani descent living inside the UK are actually that exercised about it.
Of course, it only needs a very small number of people who've been radicalised to commit violent acts, and that is the modern manifestation of terrorism, where people can be radicalised very quickly and always through social media and the internet can find the tools to act. So far, I mean, we just have to hope that this is that overseas this goes down quickly.
I take it from what you're saying that the answer to my fundamental question is observe, be very careful, but don't panic at this stage.
I think so. Yeah. Absolutely. Let's pray for things to remain relatively calm.
Let's do that, Lord Walney. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. Now, earlier on, we were talking about fuel poverty because it came up in Prime Minister's questions today. Very often, I think that PMQs is a farcical and tedious waste of time. But today it was rather good, by which I mean MPs were talking about real subjects in a serious way. And today it was the issue of child poverty. And we are still waiting to see the government's plan on that, which I think is coming very soon. Sir Michael Marmot is Britain's leading expert on it, and earlier today he was questioned by MPs investigating why Britain has some of the worst health outcomes for children anywhere in Europe. Sir Michael, who's been studying the first 1,000 days of life, joins me in the studio now. Sir Michael, it's great to have you here. We're waiting for this big government study on child poverty. Prime Minister said in the Commons today that he would pull every lever to deal with the problem. Now, you've talked a lot and very movingly about the scale of child poverty in the UK. What is the most important lever, in your view, that he could pull?
The first is what he and the Chancellor can do. What we know is out of 38 rich countries, OECD countries, from 2010 to 2020, the UK had the fastest increase in child poverty out of 38 countries. After housing costs, it went from 27% of children in poverty to over 30%, went down slightly in the first year of the pandemic with the changes, and now it's heading up again.
And that was partly the fault, was it, of austerity? I was talking to George Osborne not a little while ago, and of course he was the architect of austerity.
Well, if we look at two big changes, the tax and benefit system. If you take families with children, families of working age with children, the effect of the changes to the tax and benefit system in the decade after 2010, people in the poorest 10% of income had a fall in income of 20%. In the next poorest 10%, it was about 12% drop. And then the richer they were, the less the drop in income.
Pretty dramatic.
So it was very dramatic, very regressive changes to the tax and benefit system. And then, if I may, there was a second dramatic change. As you know well, the funding to local government went down dramatically. Most of local government funding came from the centre. That went down by 59% over the decade. We plotted life expectancy for every local authority in England in 2010-12, and then looked at the subsequent reduction in local government spending power up to 2020. The shorter the life expectancy in 2010-12, the steeper the subsequent reduction in local government spending.
Wow.
It looked like
exactly the reverse of what you would expect and hope to happen.
Exactly the reverse. It was as if, I'm not suggesting that they did it consciously, but it was as if they said, the worse the health of a community, the more money we're going to take away. And then you're surprised if health inequalities get bigger and the lot of children in the poorest areas gets worse.
And very sadly, we are now where we are. So does that mean when this government's looking at the problem, and of course they have very little money to spend at the moment, but they should be looking at things like the 2-child cap on benefits, which has affected an awful lot of families rather dramatically?
There are two approaches that my colleagues and I have been taking. One is what the centre can do. like the two-child cap, changes to the tax and benefit system. But the second is local action, which is really impressive. The 50 Marmot communities we're working with in England, Wales and Scotland, none has said, oh, look, the financial settlement is dreadful, there's nothing we can do. They're taking real action locally to reduce child poverty and reduce the consequences.
This is a really, really good story I think people don't understand. Just remind people how the Marmot centres actually work.
Going back, I did my Marmot review in 2010, and we had a set of recommendations to reduce health inequalities. The government that was elected, the Conservative-led coalition government, pretty well went in the opposite direction to all the things that I said. The city of Coventry in 2013 said, we will be a Marmot city. We'll take your report. Give every child the best start in life, education, employment, income.
So this is really active local action.
We'll do it at the city level. And then Greater Manchester took it up. Andy Burnham was a great champion of it. Cheshire and Merseyside, all around the country, they're doing it.
We so rarely hear good news stories from politics,
wonderful.
but this is one that we should focus on. And you've been talking about the first 1,000 days in life. Just explain to people why the first 1,000 days is so important.
What happens, our number one recommendation is give every child the best start in life. We can think about health of children, but also good early child development. Children, there are two parts to that, a positive and a negative. The poorer the family, the less the positive. So talking to children, playing with children, singing, all those good things are progressively less common, the greater the poverty.
Yeah.
Parents are just ground down by their poverty. And the poorer they are, the greater the frequency of negatives, adverse childhood experience. They both damage children's development. And a child that's not ready for school does less well in school.
And it's the mental development during those first absolutely
mental
crucial years.
Cold homes damages children's lungs, and children who do less well in school end up in worse social economic circumstances later in life with worse health.
So, Michael, I wish I could suddenly put you in charge of all of this at the heart of government. But for now, thank you very, very much indeed for coming in and talking to me. Coming up, the second part of the review into the dreadful Southport attack has come to some critical conclusions about the police. We're going to hear from the man who once led the Met's counter-terrorism force. But the time now, 6:32, and Amelia Cox has your news headlines.
Pakistan's High Commissioner has urged the British Pakistani community to remain peaceful in the wake of Indian strikes on Kashmir. A number of protests are taking place across the UK following an exchange of fire between the two countries. More than 130 cardinals have gathered in the Sistine Chapel to begin the secret conclave meeting to choose the next pope. Smoke indicating whether or not one has been chosen will be released from a specially erected chimney this evening. And former Chancellor George Osborne has told LBC the Conservatives should talk less about transgendered toilets and more about taxes. Speaking on Tonight with Andrew Marr, he says chasing Nigel Farage's tail isn't going to work. LBC weather, cloud cover for much of the UK tonight. A shower possible in eastern areas, but generally clearer in the west. A low of 4 degrees.
This is LBC.
or over.
This is LBC. Message Andrew Marr on WhatsApp now on 0345 6060 973.
6:35. British police haven't kept up with the way that social media disinformation accelerates trouble on the streets, according to a new report out today on last summer's Southport riots, when mosques and hotels housing migrants were attacked. The police inspectorates decided there was no evidence that the disorder had been coordinated by extremist groups, but rather mostly by disaffected individuals and groups online. So what, in practical terms, can the police do to respond better? I'm joined now by Neil Basu, former head of Counter-Terrorism Policing and former Assistant Commissioner at the Met. Neil, it's very good to have you back on the show. Can I ask you for your reaction to this report, and in particular the suggestion that actually the police have got to be a lot more savvy about the online disinformation than they've been up to now?
Well, that's an absolute no-brainer. But before I get to that, I mean, reading the two reports together, I think, is important. It's been very difficult today. This report is 106 pages long. It's a very typical, I'm sure Sir Andy Cook won't mind me saying, it's a very typically thorough HMIC FRS report, which comes with a lot of detail, a lot of recommendations, and a big price tag attached. And that will absolutely be in the place for building a better intelligence and communication system that's able to predict in a 24/7, 365 society that we have now, where world events overtake you very, very quickly indeed. I do want to call out some balance in the report, though, that, you know, he's called out the bravery of the frontline officers, many of whom were injured and some of whom were hospitalised, and we saw the brutality of that at the time. Also, the rapid investigations, which helped quell the riots, so some great detective work from their uniformed colleagues as well, and the need for greater welfare provision for police officers, because this is something that hasn't been well funded in the past. We've only just started talking about, and that will be crucial for public safety going forward, that you have officers who are fit and well supported and well cared for. But there's a lot of stuff in this report, not just on social media, that looks like policing wasn't as prepared as it could have been, couldn't mobilise as fast as it could, was ill-equipped in some respects, and of course the intelligence picture was confused and patchy, and it looked to me like we hadn't learnt the lessons or got the corporate memory from 2011. And it's no coincidence to me that that was 14 years ago, and after 14 years of austerity, you're looking at an under-resourced and over-prioritised service here. And this report, all it will do will add more pressure and more funding for a regional and national approach, which hasn't been well cared for by the current leadership.
So this is something, in your view, the Home Office should be spending a lot of time and, if necessary, a bit of money on as well. I know money is very short everywhere, but this should be a priority.
Well, particularly you mentioned the department, yes.
Yeah, you mentioned welfare just now. Just explain a little bit more about why you think that is such a central question.
Well, I think there's an awful lot being written about bad policing in the media, and with the greatest respect, and I know I'm on your show here and I don't want to antagonise the media, but it is very easy to find a story about bad policing and very hard to find one about good policing. And normally you find that good policing is only reported when somebody is killed or injured in the line of duty, and actually this was a very good example of that. The idea that officers aren't trying their hardest to walk that thin blue line between protests while getting pilloried from both sides, often for being too soft by the right and too hard by the left, and nevertheless are left sometimes injured, demoralised and incredibly fatigued. Yes. And there has to be a better plan in place for looking after those officers. And that's what the police covenant was all about. Yeah. It needs to be better funded.
Picking up your line about the thin blue line, I was just talking to Lord Walney just now about the danger of the Kashmir crisis spilling out onto the streets of Britain. And I just wonder what your perspective is. Is that a real threat that we should be thinking about going forward?
There's a good connection to this report to that, because I did hear a little bit of what Lord Walney was saying, and I agree with him. It's not on the same scale as Gaza, and I wouldn't anticipate it being so. But you do have diaspora from Pakistan and India in this country. There will be tension. I've heard calls for calm from Pakistan for UK citizens from their High Commissioner here. I'm sure we'll hear the same thing from Indian commissioners. But chief constables who have those diasporas on their patch in their local communities will be looking for community tension indicators, some kind of intelligence for communities. That's very linked into the report we've just been discussing in terms of whether that is online, being organised by individuals or by groups. You would expect neighbourhood policing and the community intelligence you can get from neighbourhood policing to be a source of that, as it was in 2011. It wasn't good enough then, and it certainly won't be good enough now, because that particular facility has been hollowed out over austerity. So in order for chief constables to get a handle on what's happening and to feed that back into the centre for national mobilisation, I would be concerned that will be difficult for them.
Neil Basu, it's always good to have you on this show. I always enjoy it. Thank you very much. Now then, a big win for the families of victims of violent crimes today, as the government announces measures to force violent criminals to attend their court sentencing in person. The minister introducing these, Alex Davies-Jones, Minister for Victims and Violence Against Women and Girls, well, she came into the studio and she told me about the kinds of cases that she's hoping to target with this new law.
Well, sadly, Andrew, there have been far too many cases of this type where evil perpetrators have failed to attend their sentencing hearings, causing even more pain and anguish to the victims and their families. I think one of the
basically out of cowardice.
Yeah, it is out of cowardice that they are refusing to attend, or in some instances they attend and then totally disrupt the hearing and are cause even more trauma to the victims and families who need to have their day in court, because justice isn't optional. I think for listeners, one of the most high-profile cases was that of Olivia Pratt-Cobell, who was a little girl in Liverpool who was sadly gunned down in her home, and the evil perpetrator was given a whole life order and then failed to attend that sentencing hearing. And it's a really important moment for the families, and I want to pay tribute to the families. Cheryl Cobell, Olivia's mum, has been one of the standout campaigners, but as have the families of Jan Mustafa, Sabina Nessa, Zara Alina. As I've said, there's been so many instances of this type.
And this is often where the impact statement about what's the effect on the family is read out. And if the perpetrator isn't there to hear it, what's the point?
It is, exactly. This is where the victims get to tell the perpetrator their pain and the impact of their crimes and their actions has had on them directly. It's really, really important part of the justice process.
So I suppose the obvious question is, particularly with people who already have a whole life sentence, what actually can a judge do to compel them to turn up and behave themselves?
Well, exactly. And the previous Conservative government did have a measure to introduce this compelling the perpetrator to attend their sentencing hearing. But all that was an option to incentivise the perpetrator to come at the judge's disposal under the previous measure was an extra 2 years on your prison sentence. Now, as you say, and as families told us when we came into government, if you're already serving a whole life order or a whole life sentence, 2 more years added on to prison time isn't going to make the blind bit of difference to you. Why would you bother? Therefore, we had to go back to the drawing board and work with the families and work with the judiciary and the prison officers around what was possible. And I'm really pleased to say that our measure does go further than the previous government.
Give people listening some examples.
So the judge, for the first time ever, will have the option to issue sanctions on the perpetrator once they are behind bars. So we know prison is a form of punishment, and it should be. But the judge now will also have the option to limit some of the privileges that can be in prison. For example, extra time in the gym, access to a work programme, access to television, or even cellular confinement will be on the table for the judge to issue.
Because some of the prison officers have suggested that in-person family visits, in other words, family visits not behind a screen, should also be on the table.
And that is something that we're considering. Look, we're leaving no stone unturned here to ensure that perpetrators of these evil crimes do come to court, they face up to the families and the victims, and they hear justice being done in person.
All Labour MPs, I think, at the moment are reflecting on the English local election results last week. In Wales, you have elections coming next year, and the opinion polls are very, very bleak for Labour at the moment. I mean, Reform are raging ahead in Wales as applied, and everybody is talking about the winter fuel allowance issue in Wales as in England. Do you think this is something the government's going to have to change their mind on?
I think it's really important that we listen to the public and that we listen to voters. And what they told us 12 months ago when they went to the ballot box at the general election was they wanted change. And clearly, we need to be delivering that change quicker and people need to feel it better. I think the announcement yesterday of the India trade deal is the start of the process of growing the economy. You know, Rachel Reeves has had to make really difficult decisions, the winter fuel allowance being one of them. And these are difficult decisions for us, but also when we were elected 12 months ago, 10 months ago at the general election, we didn't want to pull the wool over the public's eyes about how difficult the situation was going to be. It's about restoring trust and credibility in politics, and we are beginning to show that change.
It is a genuinely difficult situation, but Lady Morgan, for instance, who leads your party in Wales, has said she would like to see that policy changed, but you don't agree with her.
I think that we are where we are on winter fuel. It's important. Look, it was a difficult decision for us as a party, but the Chancellor has been clear, as has the Prime Minister, that we will not be reviewing that policy. We've kept it to protect the most vulnerable of pensioners. They will still be receiving winter fuel allowance. And of course, I think it's important to note that we've also protected the triple lock on pensions. So pensioners this year in April have received a pay rise on their pension and they will continue to do so. What is important is that we grow the economy and people start to feel that change. For my part, as the Victims Minister, I'm hearing from victims that they want change in the criminal justice system. And that is why the bill that we've introduced today, the Victims and Courts Bill, goes some way to doing that. But I agree, it needs to be quicker and people need to feel it.
All right, Alec Davies-Jones, thank you very much for coming in and talking to LBC.
Thank you.
Well, let's pick up on a little more of what we heard from the Victims Minister there about the threat for reform to the government. From LBC's political correspondent, Aggie Chambre. She has been speaking to the former Transport Secretary, Louise Hay.
That's right, Andrew, I have. And I asked her whether or not this Labour government is taking the threat of reform of Nigel Farage seriously enough. And, you know, I should say that this is one of her first interviews since leaving government. She did leave government because of a decade-old fraud case resurfacing. When I asked about reform, she said there will have been shock in central government after the results, which she called catastrophic.
I cannot believe that people at the heart of government are not reeling from the local election results last Thursday. I'm confident that they will have been really shaken by the loss of councillors and the slippage from Labour to Reform. I think, you know, they were existential for the Tory party, but they have to be the canary down the mine for the Labour government as well, because it really feels like the tip of an iceberg, and that is not the lowest we can get. We could lose a lot more to reform over the coming weeks, months and years.
Louise Hay saying that it could get a lot worse. She also said that she thinks there should be an economic reset, saying basically if there's not a wealth tax introduced, this government will have to do more welfare cuts, more cuts to public spending.
There does now need to be a different course of action on the economy, because we cannot sit back and allow ourselves to be tossed and turned on the winds of global change and keep coming back and cutting public spending and cutting the welfare bill every time that happens. That's why I'm arguing that we need to find other ways to raise money, ideally through a wealth tax, to avoid us having to make these unpalatable decisions every few months.
A classic left critique there from Louise Hay. Did she say anything about the briefings against her fellow female cabinet ministers in particular?
Yes, she did. So this is something she had said yesterday, that she accused male advisers of targeting her female colleagues with negative briefings. And I asked her whether Keir Starmer should take control of this, whether he should sack the people who were briefing. And she said if anyone was found to be briefing, they should be sacked immediately.
Wow, don't mess with Louise Hay, certainly at the moment. All right, thank you very, very much indeed, Aggie. Now then, cardinals are gathering in the conclave to decide Pope Francis's successor today. We're going to be shedding some light on one of the most secretive elections in the world. The time now is 6:48.
Coming up at 7 on LBC, Ian Dale.
We'll have the very latest on Kashmir, but I also want to know if there's a danger of this dispute coming to the streets of some of our big cities, like it did in 2019.
Ian Dale on LBC.
apply.
Tonight with Andrew Marr. Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play LBC.
6:50. Right, let's go back to one of the seismic moments of last week in politics. The huge victory of Mark Carney's Liberals in the Canadian election, crushing a Conservative party which until recently looked a shoo-in to win it. The leader of that party, Pierre Poilievre, also suffered what we would call here a Michael Portillo or Liz Truss moment, losing his own seat. The man he lost to is the Liberal politician Bruce Fanjoy, who joins me now. Mr. Fanjoy, first of all, congratulations on your victory. Was it in any sense a surprise to you?
Well, first of all, thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here. I can't say it was a surprise to me. We've been working on this for over 2 years, and winning is a process. It's not a moment. So we could see that all the work that we were putting in was resonating with folks in this riding of Carleton. I of course didn't know how the night would turn out when the votes were counted, but when it did go our way, it felt like the result of a well-executed campaign.
Yeah. I assume, all that said, that the arrival of Trump and his remarks about Canada had a big impact on the election. Was there a moment going around house to house where you suddenly realised that Trump was your best recruiter?
Well, there's no question that the election of Donald Trump, and in particular his choice to voice hostility towards Canada, both in terms of our economy and also political sovereignty, that really focused the minds of a lot of Canadians and across the country, but also here in Carleton. And it became the ballot issue above all other ballot issues, and that was who was going to be best qualified to stand up to Donald Trump and the U.S. administration and guide Canada through this storm. And in Mark Carney, we had someone who was uniquely qualified to do that.
Politics, democratic politics included, is about energy and it's about emotion. Did you have a genuine sense of the atmosphere around you almost visibly changing?
Yeah, I mean, for much of the time that I've been working at this, I knocked on over 15,000 doors myself before the election was called. So I had thousands upon thousands of conversations with voters, and I was making very good connections with them. However, the wind was in my face prior to the change in leadership that brought Mark Carney to the leadership of the party and Prime Minister of the country. After that happened, the wind was at our back.
At your back, okay. We were all watching, of course, as I'm sure you were as well, Mr. Carney with Donald Trump in the White House this week. And I was very struck that your Prime Minister gave the President of the United States every chance to walk away from his remarks about the 51st state and the fictitious nature of the line drawn across the country and the rest of it. And he just wouldn't. He kept coming back to the subject. What are your reflections on the way Trump is handling this now?
Well, the president is who he is. We don't control what he says. What I think the Prime Minister did exceptionally well was stand up for Canada, make it clear that Canada is not for sale, but there is a partnership to be had on both economic grounds and security grounds, and that's where our focus will be. But we're also expanding our relationships with reliable partners around the world. I think that's also very important.
That's very important indeed. Well, Bruce Fanjoy, congratulations again, and thank you so much for talking to LBC. From one election to another, because in the Vatican, the conclave to choose a new pope has started. Phone signals have been cut to stop leaks. The Swiss Guard, with their helmets and their halberds, have taken up position and the doors have been locked as 133 cardinals decide whether to choose a pope who will follow the liberal vision of Pope Francis or a more conservative figure. You might have seen the film, jolly good film as well, but this is not a film. This is real life, and I'm joined now by Catherine Pepinster, the former editor of the Catholic Tablet and a historian of the papacy. Catherine, an extraordinary moment for the Catholic Church, of course. Do you have any sense of whether we're in for a very long conclave or a short one?
Ideas, Andrew, about conclaves are nearly always proved wrong. There's an old saying, Italian saying, that the man who enters the conclave, a pope, comes out a cardinal. That's reflecting how unpredictable it is to say who might become the pope and also say how long a conclave might last. The last two conclaves were over within a couple of days. It's highly, highly unusual for them to decide immediately. So I don't. So
there'll be some black smoke before the white smoke.
Yes, I don't think anybody's expecting white smoke tonight, although everybody seems to be monitoring it very closely, and the cameras have been on the chimney of the Sistine Chapel where the smoke will come out, and so far the only interesting thing has been a seagull flying around. We have to be patient.
Sorry. We have to be patient. Catherine, I've been watching and reading all the various possible candidates, and it's quite complicated. But in the end, it seems to be a choice about whether to follow Pope Francis's version of the Church or take a more conservative route. Is that essentially the decision that's being taken?
I think there might be a third decision, which is to not continue the speed of reforms in the Catholic Church, but sort of bed down and focus on what's been going on in the last 12 years and let those reforms take a bit of shape. I think a lot of people are feeling a little bit worn out by how much has gone on, and perhaps they feel they want some continuity, but at the same time not still go for it. So I think that might be the third choice. And I think that's the kind of thing that we might see coming through, because the person who is elected Pope needs a 2/3 majority. So as they vote and they see candidates who are definitely not going to make it, some votes will will shift from one candidate to the other. So they might start to look for somebody who might be a bit of a compromise and will please more of them more of the time.
And I'm right, Catherine, to say that if the new Pope chooses the name Francis or even John, it's likely to be more liberal, and if he goes for Pius, then we're in for a conservative period. Is that a fair, brutal assessment?
That's a reasonable assessment. Yes, I think it is. Of course, we had one or two called John Paul that were a bit of a mix.
A bit of a mix. We'll be watching for the smoke very, very carefully, but thank you so much, Catherine. After the Conservatives were left with a dismal share of the result in the local elections last Thursday, I spoke to the former Chancellor George Osborne today. He gave me his take on whether imitating Reform and Nigel Farage was the answer to their problems.
I don't personally think chasing Nigel Farage's tail is going to work. And if you want Nigel Farage, why not have Nigel Farage? I think the kind of 10-year trend inside the Conservative movement of trying to copy the Brexit Party or the UKIP Party or now the Reform Party has not really worked.
The author of Austerity there. Now, if you missed any of today's show, you can listen back catch up on both Global Player and the new LBC app, brand new LBC app, where you can stay up to date with all the latest news and opinion. You can put your news categories in the order that you want. You can pause, you can rewind live radio and listen to a range of podcasts. Download now for free from your app store. Coming up at 10 on LBC, Ben Kentish, but right now it's time for Ian Dale.
Thank you very much, Andrew. The British government has called for both India and Pakistan to calm the situation in Kashmir, where missile strikes from both sides have killed several dozen people. In the next hour, I want our British, Indian and British Pakistani listeners to educate the rest of us about what lies behind this potentially very serious conflict. We'll have the very latest from the region, but I also want to know if there's a danger of this dispute coming to the streets of some of our big cities, like it did a few years ago. On Cross